Welcome back to Dynamics Unplugged. Today we're going to be talking about vendor consignment inventory in Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations and Supply Chain Management. This is actually not really a new topic. It's a feature and functionality that's been around for quite some time, but under-discussed and perhaps underutilized in Dynamics. I'm here to kind of walk through how to set this up and the process and maybe caveats around it that could affect your business processes. So first things first, we're going to actually go ahead and create or enable a vendor for vendor consignment process. So if we go to inventory management, we'll see under the setup, we have under dimensions, inventory owners. Inventory owners are essentially who we do consignment with, who are the owners, who are our vendors. And then finally, a default record created named after our legal entity, so that when the transfer of ownership happens from vendor consignment to us because we need to consume, we need to use in production, or we need to ship that inventory, we can do that and transfer that ownership. I've gone ahead and created a vendor and added them here as an owner. So if you click new, you actually have the listing of all your vendor accounts. You select your vendor, and then it automatically populates the owner ID as their vendor account code. You can change that if you want to use the naming convention instead, so it's a little bit easier to identify rather than the vendor ID code. Today, we're going to be using this Granite Distillery. This is a new vendor we've added to sell us bourbon-soaked barrels that we can brew our beer in, and we're going to take those off on a consignment process. So our vendor's now set up. The next thing I need to do is check my warehouse, and this is really important. I would recommend that you typically have a separate warehouse for consigned inventory, even if it physically is in the same warehouse. And the reason for that is well, there are multiple reasons, actually. Number one is the consignment process, the consignment replenishment order. You'll see that when I go to create that later and bring the inventory physically into stock under consignment cannot happen into a WMS-enabled warehouse. So if your company is using warehouse management, you would at the very least need a separate non-WMS warehouse where the Use Warehouse Management Processes button is unchecked. So number one, you need maybe a default warehouse for consigned. Two, you may want multiple warehouses. Maybe you want to manage a warehouse per consignment vendor if you have multiple vendors you're doing that consignment process with. And that way you can actually link the vendor account code directly to the warehouse. That might be too much to manage, so you could just have one warehouse and maybe multiple locations as well to represent different vendors that you're doing the consignment process with. So right now we're going to work with one consigned warehouse, multiple locations, and we're going to use that Granite Distillery vendor. And then we're also going to go to our item. This is the most important piece, really, because it's something you have to set up correctly from the beginning. Otherwise, you can't use the consignment process. Just like we have with the storage dimensions and the tracking dimensions that are assigned to item, there's limitations of what can change once that item is under use. So we actually have to set the item up a specific way from the start. I'm going to go ahead and clear my filter here, and we're going to bring up a new item. That's our bourbon soaked barrels. So this is the item that's going to be bought from Granite Distillery, and we're going to keep in consignment. The first thing is you can have a warehouse management enabled storage dimension group, because after you take ownership from your vendor, you could transfer that via an inventory transfer journal into a WMS enabled warehouse and actually then use it. If you do set that up, you must remember that you're going to have a reservation hierarchy. That reservation hierarchy is going to have to use the owner dimension. The owner dimension is something from tracking dimension groups. So just like we have batch and serial control, we can have owner control, and this must be enabled and a tracking dimension group with it enabled assigned to that item. And once it is, then if you're using WMS, you also must have a reservation hierarchy that uses the owner dimension. If you're not using WMS, then you won't require the reservation hierarchy, but you still need the tracking dimension group that includes the owner. As far as the item model group, there are some limitations. You can only use either standard cost or moving average with vendor consignment. If you select an item model group that has a different costing methodology assigned, then you will get an error. So now we have our item, we have our warehouse, we have our vendor. We want to go ahead and take stock and bring it into our warehouse, into our consigned warehouse, and be able to track it in inventory. So to do that, we can go to Procurement Sourcing, and under Consignment, we have Consignment Replenishment Orders. Consignment replenishment orders are essentially a journal. It's a manual order we create when the vendor delivers consignment inventory. So I'm going to go ahead here and choose my consignment vendor. I'm going to put in the site and warehouse that I'm going to be receiving into. And I have two options of how to add lines to this order. I can manually do that, or if I wanted to use something like importing these or doing it through Open in Excel because I had many lines that I wanted to enter, I could do that as well. I'm going to go ahead and manually put in my item that I'm going to have on this consignment replenishment order. And it's populated the site, it's populated the warehouse, and I'm going to put in a location to receive in and put in a quantity. Once the vendor delivers those goods, I'm going to generate a product receipt directly from this order. And it creates a product receipt journal and now receives those goods into stock. So where did it actually go? How does it show up in my inventory? There's two places to see that. One, I could go into vendor collaboration, and that actually has a separate inventory menu called on-hand consignment inventory. We can see here we have 150 units right now of bourbon soaked barrels in stock. And I only received 50, so we must have had previously received some consignment inventory into that location as well. We also have products received from consignment inventory, which I can check. This is after we've taken ownership, so the title might be a little bit misleading. You can see there's an actual purchase order rather than a consignment replenishment order associated with this record. The next thing that typically happens is at some point we now need to transfer that ownership. But before I do that, I just wanted to show on the on-hand list how this would display consignment inventory. So we're going to type in our bourbon soaked barrel. We can add our dimensions on our site warehouse. We don't need license plate. We want to add our owner dimension. So now we can see we actually have 50 pieces we've already taken ownership of, and then we have 150 units currently sitting in consignment, and I can view the transactions that have associated with them. So there is the 100 that I just ordered, and there was 100 that I ordered previously. So after changing ownership of 50, that gives the balance of the 150 that we saw in the location. The 100 I just received and 50 that are still there from a previous order. That consignment replenishment order, I can see that in my transaction details as well, just like any other inventory transaction. The main piece being there wouldn't be a cost associated with this because we don't own that inventory. So now we need to actually take ownership, right? We want to go ahead and bring that into stock. I'm going to go back to Procurement Sourcing, and we see there's something called an inventory ownership change. And this is a journal. This is actually the only way to do this process. You can't transfer ownership through inventory adjustments or movements or the WMS app. You have to do it through an inventory journal called ownership change. And I can either manually add my lines, or if I'm a manufacturing company and I have consignment inventory on hand and I don't have enough sufficient on hand under my dimension, USMF, that I own, and there's production orders out there that require that item, I can actually use the system to search and see if there is consignment inventory I should take ownership of to meet production's demands. I don't have this particular barrel on a manufacturing order in my case, so I'm going to go ahead and just type this in. And we're going to transfer that. You can see the site. I can't change the warehouse. I can't change. And the location, the two of all of those, I can't change. The only thing we can do with this journal is change the owner dimension. It's going to do a transfer between those dimensions. It's going to leave it in that consignment warehouse, that site, that location. So if you then need to consume it on a production order or transfer to a WMS warehouse, that would be a separate transaction after the fact. So that can lead to some inefficiencies. Earlier, I said I suggest having a consigned warehouse. If your company doesn't use warehouse management at all, you could set up consignment just as locations in your own non-WMS warehouse. That way, the only thing you have to do after taking ownership is really transferring locations that could just cause some other impacts to your solution. So here, I'm using a completely separate warehouse, and I'm going to say I'm changing from the Granite ownership where there currently has inventory to USMF, and we're going to go ahead and move 25 pieces. So at the end of this process, there should be 125 still sitting in consignment, and I believe we should have 75 sitting in USMF because there's 50 there plus this 25 I'm going to transfer ownership of. And I'm going to go ahead and click post and OK. And it says posting journal. We get a positive message here. Automatic purchase creation for this vendor account. Purchase order 1228 has been created. So not only does it take that ownership dimension and change it, it now creates a PO and automatically receives it. And the purpose of that is financial. When the ownership of the inventory was our vendors, we didn't have a PO. We didn't have a true financial transaction. We just had a replenishment order to have the inventory, to have the stock. Now, when we do the ownership change, it's creating a financial transaction and receiving that inventory under the USMF owner dimension. And it will then allow us to process the invoice for the vendor and close out the process. So we can see here, a purchase order has been received for 25 units automatically upon me posting the ownership change journal. And now if I go back to screens like the vendor collaboration, I can see purchase orders consuming consignment inventory if there are any out there. So here's the POs that have been posted, like the one that I just processed. I can see products received consignment inventory, which has our 25 and our 50. And if we go view our on hand in our warehouse, we can now see 125 units still in consignment and 75 here in our inventory.